Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
On World News Tonight this Saturday, the transfer of power. George W. Bush becomes the 43rd president of the United States.
We will reform Social Security and
From ABC, this is World News Tonight, Saturday. Tonight, reporting from Washington, Aaron Brown.
Good evening. The nation has a new president. Power has again been transferred peacefully. It is easy to take such a moment for granted, see it as routine, but history has taught us better, and no matter how many times it happens or in how many different countries this now takes place, it remains a remarkable testimonial to the endurance of the American experiment. Tonight, the majesty and the business of democratic change.
The day began, as it so often has for an incoming president, at St. John's Episcopal Church across from the White House. The Church of Presidents it is called, and it was again today. The new first family, his parents, President and Barbara Bush, his new vice president, too. There was tradition here as well, the president-elect to the White House for a brief meeting with President Clinton. The wives meet as well, power transferred peacefully again. And then these two men begin their historic drive down Pennsylvania Avenue, a drive that's been made in horse-drawn carriages, today in a brand-new presidential limousine. Its significance remains unchanged. Maybe it was the weather, but there were not many people watching. The protesters and police seemed to outnumber the celebrants. And at the Capitol, majestic even in the rain, this most remarkable ceremony began.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, the Honorable William Jefferson Clinton.
The last moments of the last hour of the last day of the Clinton years. Then the moment. First, the vice president takes his oath of office. And then right hand raised, left hand on a Bible used at George Washington's inauguration. George Walker Bush became the 43rd president of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
The first few hours of a presidency, any presidency, do not define it, but in both style and substance, they can become a roadmap to what the new president values and the tone he intends to set. So it's fair that the country take a close look at Mr. Bush and what he had to say this afternoon and how he chose to say it. ABC's Terry Moran is covering the new White House.
The transition of power crystallized in a handshake, Democrat and Republican, victor and vanquished. Then President Bush embraced his father, President Bush, in an historic and deeply poignant moment.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, George W. Bush.
Mr. Bush's inaugural address lasted 14 minutes. Its theme, unity, and a call for a new civility.
Today we affirm a new commitment to live out our nation's promise through civility, courage, compassion, and character.
But the president also reiterated his bedrock campaign promises, which will become his first-term agenda.
Together we will reclaim America's schools before ignorance and apathy claim more young lives. We will reform Social Security and Medicare, and we will reduce taxes to recover the momentum of our economy and reward the effort and enterprise of working Americans. We will build our defenses beyond challenge.
Echoing his father's efforts to encourage volunteerism, Mr. Bush sought to rekindle a traditional sense of civic duty.
I ask you to be citizens. Citizens, not spectators. Citizens, not subjects. Responsible citizens, building communities of service and a nation of character.
As Mr. Bush spoke, 3 other presidents listened, along with governors, senators, and members of the House. Down Pennsylvania Avenue, the president was frequently and noisily reminded of the hard feelings and high emotions of the election. But there were also many jubilant, if bedraggled, supporters to hail his progress and cheer him enthusiastically as he left his car for a now traditional presidential stroll. Then, the new occupant of the White House walked out his front door to join his family in reviewing the parade.
Tonight, the president and the first lady will dance the night away at 8 inaugural balls, though Mr. Bush says he's not much of a dancer. Tomorrow, he'll greet the public, shaking the hand of anyone who gets in line early enough to make it inside the White House. And then on Monday, President Bush wants to hit the ground running, meeting with congressional leaders and making his first big legislative push on education. Aaron?
Terry, thanks. ABC White House correspondent Terry Moran this evening. Given all that has happened since Election Day, the counts and the recounts, the court cases, it was not surprising today that amid the celebration, there was also on the streets of the Capitol a fair amount of anger and protest. And while it didn't dominate the day, it was not ignored either. Here's ABC's Barry Serafin.
It was not a scene Washington is used to seeing on Inauguration Day. Along much of the parade route, President Bush ran a gauntlet of protesters. Overall, crowds were smaller than usual, apparently because of the cold, damp weather. But thousands of demonstrators turned out to air grievances ranging from the election to the death penalty. They faced tight security, 7,000 police from more than a dozen different agencies. At one point, a protester climbed over a barricade trying to get to the limousine carrying Vice President Cheney, but he was quickly arrested. The motorcade, which had maintained a normal pace through much of the parade, sped up as it approached the largest group of demonstrators. Even so, Mr. Bush could not avoid seeing those who came to jeer him. The demonstrations were mostly orderly, but left the new president's day marked with anger as well as celebration. Barry Serafin, ABC News, Washington.
We're joined now by our resident political analyst, George Stephanopoulos, and by Michael Beschloss, presidential historian. Good evening to both of you. George, let me begin with you. The speech said the right things. The saying of them, I suspect, is the easy part.
That's exactly right, Aaron. You know, you heard the 4 C's there: civility, courage, character, and compassion. What you didn't see was a 5th C, compromise. But with a 50-50 Senate, a tiny margin in the House, and a majority in the country who actually voted against President Bush, he'll be able to fulfill that central promise of unifying the country only if he's willing to compromise on some of the big issues: education, health care, tax cuts. We'll see if he's willing to do that in the coming days.
And in that regard, George, I wonder if education, while there are obviously some thorny parts of his plan, isn't a good place to start.
That's right. Well, education is perfect, and there's a majority in the House and the Senate for the basic principles of his education plan, as long as he's willing to compromise on the more divisive issues of vouchers. You heard that from Senator Tom Daschle today. So far, President Bush has said he's not willing to compromise. We'll see what happens over the course of the legislative process.
And Michael, I wondered as I watched the speech today if in some ways it is easier to write a great inaugural address in bad times as opposed to these really good times.
I think you're right, Aaron. You know, the greatest speeches in history have really been moments of crisis, something like Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, or Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression, or John Kennedy at the height of the Cold War, or when you've got a president who's got just a burning political philosophy, Jefferson at the beginning of his first administration. And so the result is, when you don't have those things, you really have to sort of speak from your gut. George Bush did that to some extent today, but it was largely theme music. You had the sense that this was someone who wants to unify the country, but is not going to do that, as George said, at the cost of surrendering that agenda that he put forward in the last campaign.
Mike and George, we'll talk to both of you in a little bit about the outgoing president. A couple of other quick notes here. First, inaugurations are historic, of course, by definition. Today was noteworthy for a number of other reasons as well. With his swearing in, George W. Bush became the first president in more than a century to win the presidency while losing the popular vote. 43rd president raised more money than any presidential candidate in history. He is also the first president with an MBA degree, a business background, and as of today, he is the highest paid president ever. His $400,000 annual salary is twice what Bill Clinton earned, reflecting the first presidential raise since 1969. When we come back, more of our Inauguration Day coverage. But first, behind the scenes of history, the small details of the changing of the guard.
This is World News Tonight, Saturday. Brought to you by Advil.
In Washington, this was a day about beginnings, of course, but it is also about farewells. Bill Clinton said goodbye. There are few people who can really know what it must be like to leave the White House as president that final time. We do know that Mr. Clinton worked right up to the end, granting more than 100 pardons as he walked out the door. Here's ABC's John Cochran.
An hour after seeing George Bush sworn in, Bill Clinton, for the first time in 8 years, was no longer introduced as the president of the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed my great honor and privilege to introduce to you now our 42nd President of the United States, the Honorable William Jefferson Clinton.
This was the farewell from his Washington friends. Many of them had served in his government. Many of them, like Bill Clinton, are not sure what the future holds for them.
You know how it is when you leave the White House, you wonder if you'll ever draw a crowd again.
The president told his supporters they should be proud of what his administration had accomplished.
You gave me the ride of my life, and I tried to give as good as I got.
Even though Mr. Clinton tried to keep up the spirits of his supporters, he had gone through an emotional 24 hours himself, refusing to sleep last night, savoring every hour in the White House, and working to the end. Less than 2 hours before he lost his presidential powers, Bill Clinton granted pardons to 140 Americans, including Henry Cisneros, former housing secretary convicted of lying to the FBI about payments to his mistress. Roger Clinton, the former president's half-brother, convicted of drug violations. John Deutsch, former CIA director who only yesterday pleaded guilty to mishandling classified materials. Patty Hearst, a newspaper heiress convicted of collaborating with terrorists who had kidnapped her. And Susan McDougal, a friend of the Clintons who served part of her time in jail for refusing to testify about them.
It hurt my mom and dad so much to hear, convicted felons. And now no one can ever say that to me again.
By late this afternoon, as movers transported the Clintons' belongings to their new home in Chappaqua, he no longer had the power to issue pardons. And at a welcoming rally in New York, it was the state's new senator, his wife, who got most of the spotlight.
Thank you all so much for coming out. Well done.
But to those who think Bill Clinton has seen his last hurrah, he had this to say: "I may no longer be president, but I'll be around." John Cochran, ABC News, New York.
And George Stephanopoulos and Michael Beschloss join us again. George, it was a fascinating, at times, not altogether, at least as I saw it, comfortable goodbye.
No, but oh so Clinton-esque, Aaron. I mean, look at President Clinton's last day. It had all the elements of the Clinton era. We returned to scandal with the pardons of people like Susan McDougal. Real substance. In his radio address today, he actually announced a $100 million grant to put more police on the street, one of the signature promises of his campaign, and speeches, speeches, speeches. I think it was almost unprecedented to have a former president actually give a speech after an inaugural address, a signature Clinton day.
He said once in one of his worst days, he'd work up to the last minute of the last hour, the last day. He meant it.
He sure did. And even the White House aides at 10:30 this morning, Bruce Reed and Gene Sperling, the heads of domestic and economic policy, went in and symbolically turned out the lights.
Yeah. And Michael, we journalists are always trying to turn you historians into journalists too. I just wonder if you think that history will judge him better in how he's handled himself, let's say, over the last year or so since the end of the impeachment fight.
I think they'll be impressed by the fact that he was able to remain as effective as he could after the impeachment, after a lot of people were pretty skeptical about that. But it's going to take a long time, Aaron. History requires two things: a lot more hindsight than we've got tonight, and a lot more information. That could take 10 or 20 years.
Michael, that's not the first time you've told me that. Thank you. Thank you both for joining us. You've both had a long day. When we come back, in a moment, we have more on the day and the rest of the day's news. But first, Al Gore became a private citizen today after 24 years in public life. After today's inaugural ceremonies, he went to his new home, his wife's parents' place in Arlington, Virginia, where there were many supporters there to greet him. One of George W. Bush's first acts as president was to temporarily block some of Bill Clinton's many last-minute regulations that have not formally taken effect yet. Undoing them permanently will be a far greater and more complicated challenge. The president also signed an executive order establishing ethical standards for his new administration. Senate was also at work today, rare Saturday session. Its members confirmed 7 new cabinet nominees. There was little controversy surrounding any of them, which means the tougher votes are still to come. Here's ABC's Linda Douglas.
Moments after assuming the presidency, Mr. Bush signed the formal documents submitting the names of his cabinet nominees to Congress. 2 hours later, the Senate confirmed 7 of them. Donald Rumsfeld, Defense; Colin Powell, State; Paul O'Neill, Treasury; Ann Veneman, Agriculture; Don Evans, Commerce; Roderick Page, Education; and Spencer Abraham, Energy. The new president attended the traditional inaugural luncheon with congressional leaders in Statuary Hall, which was once the House chamber. Mr. Bush promised the bipartisan group his would be a presidency of action, not gridlock.
Expectations in the country is we can't get anything done. People say, well, gosh, the election was so close, nothing will happen, except for finger pointing and name calling and bitterness. I'm here to tell the country that things will get done.
That may be easier said than done. Mr. Bush's first legislation to be submitted next week is a sweeping education reform plan which would allow parents whose children are in failing public schools to use federal money in the form of vouchers for private education. That won't fly, said one Democratic leader.
He has talked about bringing education to the Senate right away. Obviously, if education comes, we're ready to work. If he insists on vouchers, you've got your first problem.
Some moderate Democrats like the sounds of Mr. Bush's education plan, but they are wary of his other big priority, the $1.6 trillion tax cut. Some Republicans are also urging him to move slowly on taxes, but most in his party do not want him to give an inch.
Republicans have been in the political wilderness for 8 years now. They finally got the White House, so there is tremendous demand for Bush to appease various constituencies in the Republican Party.
A deep ideological divide between Republicans and Democrats was exposed this week in the confirmation fight over Attorney General nominee John Ashcroft. Bipartisanship may not come easily. Members of both parties are surprised that Mr. Bush seems so determined to pursue his agenda without seeking or floating ideas of compromise first. Some think that may mean he will be a tough negotiator, Aaron.
Linda, thanks. ABC's Linda Douglas at the Capitol. On the subject of deep divisions, you certainly saw them today in Tallahassee, Florida. About 3,000 protesters gathered during the inauguration there. Many in the crowd said George W. Bush won their state's electoral votes only because large numbers of black voters were disenfranchised. They do not accept Mr. Bush, they say, as the legitimate president. Still ahead from us tonight, the dance of politics at the inaugural ball.
Even like a maniac, you don't care about the way I feel. No need coming back. Gonna get alive. That's what I'm gonna do.
Quick review of our main story today, the new president and the transfer of power here in Washington. At noon today, George W. Bush became the 43rd president of the United States, promising in his inaugural address to work to build a single nation of justice and opportunity. And President Clinton, now former President Clinton, said goodbye after pardoning more than 100 people during his final moments in office. Among those receiving a pardon, his brother Roger. And finally from us tonight, the celebration goes on. 8 inaugural balls await. It'll be a long night for the new first couple who are expected to show up at all of them. The big one is always the president's ball, and over the years it has said a lot about the new president and his style. Here's ABC's Deborah Amos.
When is a dance not just a dance? When the dance is the president's inaugural ball.
The kind of entertainers he invites, the kind of people who come, that is oftentimes a beacon on what kind of an administration this really will be.
And I love Texas.
Beef and boots are George W.'s theme.
It will be one of unity, coming together, and with a little bit of a Texas twist on it.
The twist was different in the 1960s. The Kennedys ushered in glitter and glamour, but there were hints of a darker side. Singer Frank Sinatra produced the inaugural ball. To the man who had just left office, it was a scandal.
Eisenhower had read Sinatra's FBI files and the accusations of mafia connections. Eisenhower said to his friends, I can't imagine that Kennedy would bring someone like that into his inaugural.
Jimmy Carter insisted his inaugural was a party, not a gala. He ran against Washington, partied with the people. The tickets were cheap, a symbol of a less prosperous time. Even Rosalind's dress was a gown she'd made and worn before. dress showed the Carter years were over. The dance in white tie and tails. For the first time, corporations picked up the enormous tab. It was okay to be rich again.
There was a feeling that we needed to return to something slightly more elegant and more formal.
Forget formal. This administration began with a sax. Clinton ran as a populist, partied with Hollywood high rollers.
The last 8 years we have seen great highs and we have seen incredible lows.
Now, another beginning.
It has all come together. You've got two bitter rivals, and the transfer of power has been very smooth.
For today, at least. But after the parties are over, it may take more to bring the nation together. Deborah Amos, ABC News, New York.
That's our report. Sam and Koki on the new administration tomorrow on This Week. I'm Aaron Brown in Washington. Good night for all of us at ABC News.